I'm Tim Norton, the Executive Director of the Foundation here at Daytona State College, and I wanted to say thank you for joining the WISE presentation, the virtual presentation. I think this is our third one that we've done, and today we've got a great person to present from the Museum of Art and Science. Kristen will introduce him in just a moment, but I wanted to tell you that we're grateful for your continuing support. We've had a lot going on at the college. Enrollment is doing really well. Considering the pandemic, we've had a little drop off in enrollment, but we have classes virtually as well as in person now. And so we're back at least somewhat hosting classes on campus. We do hope possibly to have access to be able to do some WISE presentations in the spring, live and in person, but we're still working out the details on that, and we'll be able to have a little bit more information possibly right after the first of the year. But I thank you for your continuing interest and your support of the college. I literally just came out of a meeting with a woman from DeLand who's been a participant in WISE over the years and established a scholarship several years ago, and she was coming in to add to her scholarship. So it was a great few minutes just before I came in for the presentation. But again, thanks for your support. Thanks for all that you do, for what you mean to Daytona State College, to our students. And without any further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Kristen Hansen, our Director of Alumni Engagement and Development. She'll introduce our presenter for today, and I wish you all the best. I look forward to sampling some of Costa's food next week at the presentation. I'm sorry, I'll just have to do it. I know that you wish you could be here, but we'll take up the slack for you and sample Costa's food next week. So Kristen, take it away.
Great, thanks, Tim. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining in our third virtual presentation. As Tim said, we're excited that you're all tuning in. I think last week a lot more of the members were able to tune in, so we were happy about that. We have a great presentation today. Zach is with us from the Museum of Arts and Sciences right here in Daytona off of Nova. We did have this set up for April 7th. However, obviously we had to cancel it. So Zach was kind enough to put together a virtual presentation for us, but he said that he would love to do a live presentation in the future. So hopefully we'll be able to schedule something whenever we are all able to meet in person. If not, he has a few other virtual presentations that he said we could possibly do this spring. So please enjoy, sit back. We do have, remember, we have the question and answer chat button. You can type in any questions, and when Zach is done with his presentation, I'll read him the questions. He'll answer, and then we will say a quick goodbye. And as Tim said, that wasn't very nice of him, we're probably going to be able to see Costa. We haven't seen him in a while, but he'll put on his show, cooking show next week. So look forward to having you enjoy this today with Zach, and we'll tune in next week as well. Okay, Zach, thanks so much.
So thanks for having me here with the WISE program. I've been with the museum for come January 27 years. Started out as a volunteer my first 2 years as a docent guide, and kind of worked my way up. And I am the senior curator of education and history. I've done a lot of programs with the WISE group here over the years for a long time. Do a lot of history presentations, and I'm excited to be back. And then again, hopefully in the future we'll be back live, not too long from now. So this is about MOAS treasures. So the Museum of Arts and Science is located at 352 South Nova Road in Daytona Beach, not too far from the most important restaurant in Daytona Beach, which is the Krispy Kreme, which is right there at the corner. So I'm kidding, obviously. But if you come down International Speedway and you come to the big intersection of Nova and International Speedway, where the park, the Krispy Kreme, and some other businesses there, go south on Nova Road, it comes up on the right. It sits back into the Tuscaloosa Forest, so it's a little bit hard to see. The museum is well over 50 years old. It started out as a children's museum in 1950, and it is really grown into, if you can believe this, the largest general museum in the Southeast United States. If we go on to the next slide, I really appreciate that. And so the museum recently has gone under about a 7-year renovation and about $27 million put into the museum. Almost every aspect of the museum has been renovated, from a brand new digital planetarium, now called the Lohman Family Planetarium, to the C.C. and Hyatt Brown Museum. All the galleries, spaces, most of them have been renovated as well. So it's really a pretty awesome place. And it is one of the few museums in the South, actually in the whole country, that does art, science, and history. We do all 3 disciplines. We do 3 disciplines: art, science, and history. So we have exhibits on all of those. We also bring in traveling exhibits, different traveling exhibits from different parts of the country. So we have changing galleries and permanent galleries, and we have collections from all over the world. The museum has about 30,000 objects, and of course, they're not all on display at any one time. So the museum, when I started, was about 45,000 square feet. It's about 135,000 square feet now, and it is one of the first Smithsonian affiliates in the nation, so we're a Smithsonian affiliate as well. If we go on to the next slide, that'd be great. And of course, the museum also had the addition that now sits out onto Nova Road. It's give us a lot more exposure. The C.C. and Hyatt Brown Museum of Art, which houses, this is one of our treasures. Matter of fact, the whole museum there is a treasure. So there's 2 facilities. There's the C.C. and Hyatt Brown Museum, and then the main campus. It's all on one campus in Tuscaloosa Preserve. This is the largest collection of historical Florida landscapes in the world. These paintings date back from 1830s to about 2000, with a great deal of them being in the 1880s, 90s, and early turn of the century. There's almost 3,000 paintings. There's about 400 on display at any one time. And most of these artists are some of the best landscape painters that ever lived. Landscape painting is fairly new. It's not something that dates back 1,000 years. It does, but it was always just in the background. But as a landscape, to be just beautiful as a landscape, it's actually fairly new form, only dating back, to the early 1800s, really, when landscaping, just for a landscape just to be beautiful on its own, became popular. So these landscape artists, all from all over the world, came to Florida for the same reason that most people did. They came as tourists, fell in love with the sunsets, fell in love with the exotic rivers draped with oak trees and cypress trees draped with Spanish moss, and they painted these scenes. So it's really quite amazing. There are historical landscapes, engravings, still lifes, history scenes, pure landscapes, and some portraiture as well. C.C. and Hyatt Brown are benefactors of the museum. You may have heard of Brown & Brown Insurance, and they have donated their entire collection to the museum. They've been collecting for over 20 years Florida landscapes. There are some highwaymen. A lot of people have questions about that. There's about 5 highwaymen. This is a fine art collection. The highwaymen are a folk art collection, and we have about 5 of those. There's actually one of them on display right now. If we go to the next slide, that'd be great. So one of the great treasures of the museum that really was the early foundation of the museum was Armadillo Gallery, and that is the giant ground sloth. So in 1975, the giant ground sloth was discovered in a pond south of the museum, about 2.5 miles. This is how you find fossils. Usually in 2 ways you find fossils, either through erosion, where the bones have become, where the ground has eroded and exposed the bones, like in rivers from ice and wind and rain, or in construction sites. And this was discovered in a construction site in a borrow pit. That means they're borrowing the dirt and they're taking it to another place in dump trucks, usually for road fill or whatever they're going to use it for. And that's at Reed Canal Pond today. If you see Reed Canal Pond in South Daytona, that's where they found the giant ground sloth. They found evidence of 13 giant ground sloths, making it the largest die-off ever found in the world of giant ground sloths. That's natural, where they didn't fall into a tar pit or a sinkhole. They don't really know why. The skeleton that you see on your screen is 130,000 years old, and these animals evolved 50 million years ago in South America, came across the land bridge of the Isthmus of Panama, 3 million years ago when it was formed. Of course, lots of animals crisscrossed back and forth, some going from North to South America, some going from South America to North America. And one of the ones that came north was this giant ground sloth. And this is called a megatherium because it's huge. It would have weighed anywhere about 5,000 to 8,000 pounds. What makes this a treasure is that this is the most complete skeleton in the world ever found of this species of giant ground sloth. There are lots of species of giant ground sloth, believe it or not, but of the big ones, this is the most complete. It walks on all fours on the sides of its hand, but we have it in an upright position where it would grab branches, because it's a herbivore, and pull these big branches to its mouth, and it would eat all the leaves off of the trees. It had a tongue probably almost 2 feet long that would roll out. There's just a few pieces that had to be replicated. The skull is a remake. It's what's called a cast, and the real one is in another case. They rarely ever put the real skulls on fossil specimens. Let's go to the next slide, please. Here's just some archive of the dig at Reed Canal Pond. My wife is from Ormond Beach, and she was out there as a volunteer probably when she was about 11 or 12. And the man in the blue shirt there is Don Sorbosic. He's the gentleman that discovered it. He was a local TV repairman and amateur fossil collector. The gentleman in the tan shirt who's really muddy and dirty, these amateur paleontologists, they're actually getting ready to prepare the skull. So they found a skull, which is really, really rare. It's very, very fragile. And that is the curator of science at that time. That's Steve Hartman. And the picture below you see is the bottle pit where they had a crane and a drag line, and they dropped in the bucket into the bottom of the pond, scoop up all this muck and dirt. And in all that muck and dirt, guess what? Fossils. Fossils of animals from the last ice age, dating back 130,000 years ago. The last ice age ended 13,000 years ago, and many of them went extinct, especially the big, what they call megafauna, animals over 100 pounds. Let's go to the next slide. So they drained that pond, and then that's when they were able to pull out all the fossils. That was in about 1975 to 1977. The sloth has a new gallery. It was originally mounted and put on an exhibit in 1980. So this is its 40th anniversary. In October, actually, it was. So it's really awesome. You can see how it stands up. You can see it has powerful legs. If you see the legs, though, what's really interesting, because it's a pretty primitive animal, its femurs or its thigh bones are like rectangles. They're not like circular like most animals. So it's a really unusual animal. Very hairy, had red-colored fur hair. And it had no enamel on its teeth. It probably ate 300 to 500 pounds of plant food a day. It is related to the tree sloth today and the armadillo. Next slide, please. Here's just another picture of it before we had moved it into its new permanent home, because you may remember a few years back we had a horrible flood and they redid the gallery. Next slide, please. There's an archive footage of them separating all the bones, and most complete. So they didn't have any directions or picture on a box to go by. So Dr. Gordon Edmonds is the one who assembled it. Next slide, please. And then there they are assembling the skull, putting it together, getting it ready for display. Next slide. And then there was so they found 13, and there was enough for 2 complete skeletons. One went to the Museum of Arts and Sciences, which was a tiny museum of like 2,500 square feet, big fundraiser put on to create a new gallery for it. And then the second one, which is this one, is the sister sloth, as we call it, that's in private hands. But evidence of 13. Next slide, please. This is a really important object in that gallery. It's the Prehistory of Florida Gallery, is where the sloth lives. It's a bison skull, and then there's a Cuveronius tusk there. And that animal was supposed to have gone extinct, that tusk that belonged to a type of elephant called a mastodon. It has a spiral ring around its tusk. It was supposed to have gone extinct 600,000 years ago in Florida. But when we excavated in Reed Canal, we realized it was 130,000 years old, and that kind of that kind of adjusted the date of the extinction of that animal in Florida, that it had lived well past 600,000 years ago, up until about 130,000 years ago. So that was an important find there. But that bison tusk is really important because there's a little white dot in the center of its head. It's carbon dated, it comes from Florida, doesn't come from the Reed Canal site, but it's an important object that we have. It's dated at around 12 to 13,000 years old through carbon dating, and it's a spear point, which means that humans were hunting these large mammals, and they may have hunted them to extinction. They're called Clovis people from a site in New Mexico, and they use these large blades and this thing called an atlatl, where they would launch these spears at these huge animals. So one of the extinction theories is that these animals were hunted to extinction. And then when they were in North America, they didn't know to be afraid of these new apex predators that could create weapons and think abstractly. Humans. So wherever humans appear for the first time around the globe, large mammals went extinct all over. Madagascar, Cuba, parts of Europe, Australia, you name it. Next slide, please. So let's move to another portion of the museum. You probably didn't know that we have a pretty cool treasure at the museum, and it's a bed. It's an empire bed, and it belonged to Napoleon Bonaparte from his personal chambers from Versailles. And you might want to say, well, how did the Museum of Arts and Sciences in Daytona Beach get an object like that? Well, there was a garage sale that wasn't too far from the museum. Well, I'm kidding. That's not true. I'll tell you this, and it will make sense. And by the time I finish this person's name, you'll know how we got it. William Randolph, you can finish the last name, Hearst. So it was put up for auction at Sotheby's. It was purchased by one of the benefactors of the museum and is now on display. There's one original cushion there that has the original upholstery on, and you can see it. It's in our open storage gallery. It's an empire bed, so it's what they call empire style, which was developed for the Napoleonic Empire. And it's a massive piece. It's the forerunner of the American sleigh bed. It's made of mahogany. It has massive elements to it. And the art that came out of the Napoleonic Empire, which was created by Charles Percier and Pierre Fontaine, two guys who studied in Rome, and they knew neoclassical. So empire style is all about neoclassical furniture and decorative arts. The museum has almost 2,000 original pieces of Napoleonic Empire decorative arts, including furniture. This would have been pushed up. This would have been pushed up against a wall. It's a small bed with curved scrolls, usually for one person, and it's based on ancient Greek and Roman styles. This is the important thing about the museum and why you come to the museum. You come to the museum to see things you normally don't see every day. You don't see a giant ground sloth every day. You don't see Napoleon's personal bed every single day. So the museum is like a passageway into history of these objects and these paintings. But they're set against a larger backdrop of people and places and events. And these objects usually reflect change in the taste and the styles of that time period. So you get a real great appreciation for art and culture of the people that lived in the past. So these artifacts that the museum curates is really important. And that's what the job of the curator is. And my job is to tell stories about those objects. Next slide, please. There it is, just kind of a little more of a close-up. It's really a beautiful piece. It's in the visible storage gallery with 6,000 other objects, and a lot of them are Napoleonic objects. So if you go into the visible storage gallery, it's only dedicated to decorative arts. It's the only one like it in North America that's dedicated solely to decorative arts. You'll see a working gallery where you can go into, but it's also a working collection. It's the collection room. So we actually will pull pieces out of that gallery to use. So it's actually a working storage for us. The stipulation is that from the grants that we got to build it, it's called the Helene B. Roberson's visible storage Gallery is that we have to put another object similar in its place. Next slide, please. And if you want to come and see Napoleon's death mask, there aren't that many of them in the world. We have it. It sits right next to his bed. When famous people died back in history, it was not uncommon to make a plaster mask of them, and then they used that mold to make copies. So if you want to come and see what he looked like, there's disagreement on how tall he was. Some people say 5 feet. Some people say he was 5'6", which would have been tall for the age 5'6", actually. So he was, I would presume he was probably around 5 feet. So you can come and see his death mask as well. Really interesting. There's no labels because it's storage, and we don't put labels on things in storage. Next slide, please. So here's a really cool object in the armory. We have over 200 vintage and antique weapons, swords and cutlasses and muskets. It's really quite amazing, but my favorite object, and I think the one most important object, is the one that sits in the front of the gallery right when you come in. There's a reason it's there, and that is the crossbow from the late 1600s. Now, the crossbow is an interesting invention. We don't know exactly who invented it, but it probably came from Asia, maybe the Chinese, dating back as far as 600 BC. This was a weapon of mass destruction, and the Vatican tried to ban this weapon unless it was used in the Crusades. And this was a weapon that was used quite a bit in the Crusades. Archers trained from the time they were children all the way through their entire life. This took no skill, kind of democratized archery and shooting weapons of mass destruction. It used metal arrows, which became popular as early as 1066. You might think of that as a Norman invasion into England at that time. So the problem with this weapon, though, is it takes a lot longer to load than an archer. So it takes longer to load, but it was a fierce weapon. It could penetrate armor, and it could wipe out, hundreds of people in one volley, hundreds of soldiers. Next slide, please. So I pulled up a little bit of a closer to this object, a little bit of a different view of it, and you can see it's got a lot of beautiful inlays on it, ivory inlays. This was probably not a weapon that was used in the Crusades. This was probably for a very wealthy person and was most likely used for hunting in Europe. So not a weapon that would have been used in an army, but as a private personal hunting weapon. Next slide, please. Museum has the second largest collection of CocaCola artifacts in the world on public display. And the Root family moved here in 1950. The Root family invented the Coca-Cola bottle, not the drink. The drink was invented in 1886 in Atlanta, Georgia by Dr. John Pemberton, or Doc Pemberton, who wanted to create the perfect drink and medicine. He wanted not only to taste good, but he wanted it to cure your headache and also help your digestion. What ended up happening is it just became really good tasting drink. It was a patent medicine is what it was. It's really interesting how the drink came about, because if it wasn't for the women's temperance movement that came in 1886 to Atlanta, it probably would never have happened, because it did have a little bit of cocaine in it, had alcohol in it originally, but the temperance movement came to Atlanta. Alcohol was banned. He now had an illegal drink, so he substituted it with sugar syrup. And then that's the rest of the story, because there were thousands of these patent medicines. But he was not a good marketer, and he sold the company literally for like $1,000. And it became very, very popular, and they created all types of new marketing ploys. And then, of course, the trains traveling all the way across, and the development of roads, right place, the right time. You could now distribute a product very easily nationwide. But the bottle is interesting, because what was happening is that people loved the drink. You could get it at the soda fountain, and then people started bottling it. And the Coca-Cola company didn't think, well, bottling is not very important, but it was. What was happening was that people were putting it in all these different types. People were putting in all these different types of bottles. Well, it's not standard. So they held a competition in 1950 in the Coca-Cola company. There was 11 competitors, and a small glass manufacturing company in Terre Haute, Indiana, called the Root Glass Company, which made mason jars and other fruit jars. They entered the competition and they won. And sometimes it's called the MOAS design or the hobble skirt design. We have one of 2 original bottles ever made of the prototype. It's on display. The High Museum in Atlanta, very fantastic museum in the country. They were doing a retrospective on design, and they asked the Coca-Cola headquarters if they could borrow their original bottle, which was like bottle number 1. They said no, they wouldn't even take it out of the vault. But we lent them our bottle, the High Museum in Atlanta, and we had a special case made for it. The problem that they didn't go with this bottle that's kind of really thick in the middle and thin on the bottom is that on the conveyor belt, it wasn't very stable and they kept falling off of the conveyor belt. So the original bottle was slimmed down, and they got a patent for that on Christmas Day, 1923, and they called that the Christmas bottle. So if you see the standard Coca-Cola bottle, the 6.5 ounce one, that's called the Christmas bottle, and that's when it was patented. But they had slimmed it down before that. But when they patented in 1923, this is the most famous product in the history of the world. It's the Coca-Cola. At 6.5 ounces, it weighed just around a pound of that awesome drink, chilled to a certain temperature. And when it's chilled to the right temperature in a bottle, it's fantastic. Next slide, please. So there's a picture of the Root Glass Company, and they kind of combined with Owens Illinois Glass in the 1930s, and the Root family became the largest independent bottler of Coca-Cola in the world, and they were listed on the NASDAQ, the Root Glass Company, and they were distributing Coca-Cola all over the Northeast and across the country. Next slide, please. Also in that gallery is another treasure. There are so many treasures in the museum and one-of-a-kinds. So we have the best skeleton of a giant ground sloth. We have Napoleon's Bed. We have this Crossbow, which is probably nobody else has that, at least in the state. And then we have this race car called the Sumo Special, which is a one-of-a-kind. So Chapman Route Jr. in 1950 moved the Root Glass Company down to Ormond Beach. Loved Ormond Beach. Loved the racing in the area, and he was a big racing fan. And he had a race team called the Sumo Special, which was a combination of his partner and his wife's first name, Susan Root and Mary Smith. And they combined the name to come up with Sumo Special, or Sumo Racing Team as it was known. They were usually blue and white machines, and they raced specifically at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And so he raced Indy cars, open wheel Indy cars. But Mercedes-Benz in the 1950s was experimenting by covering the fenders and trying to be more aerodynamic. And that's what Chapman Root Jr. loved. He loved technology. And we're talking about streamlining. So this is a streamlined race car, Art Deco. Streamlining is the last incarnation of Art Deco, which you've probably heard of. It came out of France right after in turn of the century, 1901, really popular after World War I, and became a little popular here in the 30s and 20s, especially in Miami with the Art Deco district. Continued on with a later form called Streamline, large geometric designs. That's what the Sumo Special is. And it raced at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. It was built by Curtis Craft Racing and had this very famous engine called Offenhauser, which won so many Indianapolis Motor Speedway records. Next slide, please. So unfortunately, in 1959, when the Speedway opened, a gentleman named Marshall Teague, who was a local driver, who also raced a very famous race car called the Hudson Hornet, which you've probably heard of. He raced for that team. He was also known as King of the Beach. He was born on US 1 in Daytona. And he raced on the beach all the time. He was a great mechanic. That's why he was known as King of the Beach. Won the races all the time. Well, he was hired by Sumo Racing Team in Chapman Route to drive this experimental car at the new Daytona Beach International Speedway. 11 days before the first Daytona 500, he wants to break a speed record, which was currently about 177, almost 178 miles. Marshall T, the local driver, he's 37 years old. He's got 2 kids and a wife, lives in Daytona. He takes that Sumo Special out on the track, gets to 171 miles an hour. The next day says, I'm going to break the closed record for being in a closed, speedway. Takes it out, gets to the third turn, gets up to about 141 miles an hour. The car spun and it flipped over several times, and Marshall Teague was killed at Daytona International Speedway in the Sumo Special. That ended really Chapman Route's ventures into racing. He ended his race team and he restored the cars. Now, Chapman Route Jr., who had this race car, he was a collector of Americana. They had over 100,000 objects of CocaCola artifacts and anything that had to do with Americana, racing and trains, you name it. Teddy bears, vintage teddy bears. Next slide, please. Also, another treasure in that gallery is the Milwaukee Road, or the Skytop Lounge. They only made 6 of these rail cars. Only 2 are known today. The others were sold to the Mexican government after they found their usefulness was over, and nobody knows about those. It's built in 1948 Skytop observation line, so it would be the last car on the line. And it ran between Chicago and Minneapolis, Minnesota, 400 miles in 400 minutes, or about 7 hours with 12 stops in between. So it's a streamliner, just like the Sumo Special. It's built on streamlining. I found out, going through some of my personal family archives not too long ago, that my grandmother, who I never met, she passed away before I was born, her name was Grace, had rode on the Milwaukee Road, but a little bit before the Skytop Lounge, and she got a thank you letter from the management. Can you imagine getting thank you letters from the management just for riding on Delta or American Airlines today, or taking a train? You got good service back then. It's a luxury car. It's an observation car on the very back, sort of like a caboose. So you would go back there and watch the day go by as you travel to Minneapolis. So it's called the Milwaukee Road. Next slide, please. There it is in action. You can see it being pulled. Really cool historic photos. Next one. And it shows you the taste of the time, and of course, and culture of the time. People got really dressed up to travel back then. They used to on planes as well. Here's an interior photo of the Skytop Lounge, and it looks like a lot of fun. It looks a little better than being packed into the Legiant plane heading out of Sanford. Packed in there. That looks like a lot of fun. Next slide. Chapman Route had purchased it, and he stored it in Sanford. It was vandalized. It had bushes, I don't say bushes, but weeds growing in it. And he had it sent to Omaha, Nebraska to be refurbished, and then it was completely restored. What's interesting is when it was restored, they were sending it back to Ormond Beach, and it got in an accident. And so they had to be sent back again to be fixed. It got backed into, and then of course it's now on display. Chapman Route had 5 different rail cars. A personal rail car is on display at the museum, and of course this very rare Skytop Lounge. Now, we had the Train Collectors Club come, and when they saw that train, they just went crazy. So you know it was very, very important. Next slide, please. Also in that gallery, another one is the CocaCola pickup trucks. They're called C cabs because they look like C's. You can see the cab where you get into it. It looks like the letter C. They're called C cabs. And when you bought it, you just got just the chassis, and then you took it to a shop, and then they would build out the bed of the truck and the cab. It was originally $600, which was about $12,000 today, and then it was reduced down to $325. By 1928, it sold 1.2 million of these, and of course then the truck craze was on. This really served a lot of truck farmers as well. Local farmers could get their product easier without having to use horse and wagon or mule and wagon. So they're really cool. One of these actually, I think the one on the left, served in the Route company as well. Next one. Going to the Chinese gallery, we have some really awesome ancestor portraits. Ancestor portraits, when you died, it didn't necessarily sever the relationship with the living and the dead. They continued to communicate to each other through these portraits that would have been commissioned between 1644 and 1911. They were done in what's called a Buddhist style of painting, which is very flat, always frontal. A lot of color. The color also tells you what the rank of the person was and what they were wearing. This was usually for wealthy people as well. They're usually always seated, and they were painted on silk, and they're on display at the museum. And I think they're just fabulous historical artifacts. These were important people. These were actually imperial servants, so they were important people. What ended the ancestor portraits? Because if you did well and you honored your ancestors, they could do good things for you and make you prosperous and have a long life. What ended the ancestor portraits was photographs, and people they changed over to photography. Next slide, please. There's a close-up of it on silk. Next slide. We go to the Cuban Museum. We have the largest collection of Cuban art in the free world outside of the island of Cuba. And we got that through Fulgencio Batista, who was overthrown by Castro. He was the last president before he was overthrown by Castro. And he had a home in Daytona Beach. He had like 3 homes. They were located on Daytona Beach where the Greek Orthodox Church is today. And they were historic homes. He actually, the home belonged to Oldsmobile of Oldsmobile was the home. And he had a house museum there. He ended up donating this collection to the city, and then eventually it was donated to the new Museum of Arts and Sciences. This was the first collection that the museum owned, and it's incredibly important. It has the collections from colonial Cuba all the way up to 1959, and then art stopped because it basically became a communist country, and now they only have one news source as well, where they had 200 at that time. And so everything just shut down, basically, culturally and artistically. This is of Don Tomas. It's painted by a man named Vincent Escobar. He's the first painter who was painting important people in Havana, like the mercantile class, the wealthy, and the nobility. And Don Tomas Cervantes is nobility. He is the Attorney General, and he is the first link between the tradition of painting in Spain as it was brought over to Cuba, because Cuba brought over their entire culture to the island. Most of the natives died off very soon, so you don't see a blending of art like you see in Mexico, where you'll see Aztec art and Spanish art blend. It's very, very European, and this is a very European style. The hand in the coat pocket was the tradition of the day. The coat of arms, it's a kind of a dark portraiture, kind of in a grand manner, as we want to call it. And what's really cool is Vincent Escobar. If you want to see a Vincent Escobar, you have to come to the Museum of Arts and Sciences. It's the only place in North America where a Vincent Escobar is on public display. So if you live in Canada and you say, I got to go see me a Vincent Escobar, you got to come to Daytona Beach. That's how incredible the museum is. I'm just giving you a small smattering of the incredible, I mean, we could be here for hours of the incredible one-of-a-kind objects that the museum has. Former portraits. Next slide. There's a close-up of it. He also was a member of the House of Charity. He was a philanthropist, what we would call today. Next slide. We also have the father of the Cuban landscape. What ended up happening is they created a European school of art in Havana, and everybody who went there had a certain curriculum, portraiture and including landscape. And then you would go to Europe and study the old masters. They brought all that technique and style back. So walking through the galleries, like walking through a gallery in Spain, in a museum gallery. It's very academic. That's what this is. We don't know much about Miguel Arias, 1841 to 1915. He was known as the father of the Cuban landscape. He definitely did a Cuban sugar mill here, and very realistic. Oil on canvas, you see the royal palms and the sugar plantation buildings in the back, and then there's a peasant watering a horse. He was known for colorful landscapes, very topographical in nature. Next slide, please. There it is, blown up. It's one of my favorite paintings in the museum. It's got great color. Look how the water leads you right into the heart of the painting. So right here in the foreground, this whole water element kind of leads you into the center of the painting. And then your eye can wander to the tall trees with a vertical perspective, and then wander over to the sugar mill and then back down to the horse and peasant watering the animal. Next slide, please. Back to the Chinese gallery. Got this a little bit out of order. This is the Tang Dynasty. Tang Dynasty was known as the greatest art period in Chinese history. It was also a time of peace. Horses were really important, incorporated into the gods and into their religion. And it created an empire. Horses held on to empire. And so this would have been for really wealthy people, wealthy nobility, and these are tomb pieces. They would have been buried. They date back to 700 AD. So if you come to the museum, come to the Chinese gallery, you can see these. Let me talk about that for a second. The museum has been open for quite a while. It's super safe. The attendance is way down. I've been there 27 years now. Cleanest it's ever been, and there are hand washing stations everywhere. So if you want to go and you're a little stir crazy, it's a great time to come to the museum. Come on a Sunday and you got the place yourself, and a Monday even more so. A mask is required. Social distancing is super easy because it's 135,000 square feet. It's really a great time to come. So these were status symbols, these Tang horses. Put into a burial. At some point, these tombs were robbed, but thank goodness they ended up into a museum and not onto somebody's mantle. Next slide, please. Here's a close-up. They're called the prancing horses. These are Arabian horses. They are low-fired earthen objects, basically made of terracotta. And some of them were done in different pieces as well. Horses were very revered, and they were status symbols. Next slide, please. These are the original horses to China. These are the Mongolian steppe horses, and they probably had riders on them. You can see the holes in the top. Those are gone. Again, those were tomb pieces. They're short, squat horses. Next one, please. Slide. And did you know that the museum in Daytona Beach has the personal rice bowl of the last emperor of China? I believe Steven Spielberg did a movie on that called The Last Emperor. He was overthrown basically by the communists, and yellow was his color. There's a 5-clawed dragon on that. Only the emperor can have a 5-clawed dragon on his decorative arts. Otherwise, you could be in massive trouble. And this Qing dynasty lasted from 1644 to 1912. So if you look closely on this, the color is right. Yellow is the color of the emperor, 5-clawed dragon. Now, he probably had several personal rice bowls, but this is one of them. And that was the last emperor, Pu Yi. And he was overthrown. They made a movie about him. Next slide, please. Hard to see in this photo. It's really even hard in the gallery. You really got to kind of get down to it like this and lower yourself to see the etched dragons on that porcelain yellow bowl. Next slide, please. And then there's Pu Yi, March 1934, born in 1906, died in 1967. And then eventually he took the vow and became a communist. Next slide, please. We have these things in the African gallery that is called kakangos. These are really important objects in the African gallery. You see, we have collections from all over the world. China, America, you name it. And these were sort of burial markers for people who lived in Kenya, the Maji Kenda, of a secret society of men called the Gohu Society. They were called the Blessed. And when one of these men in the secret society died, they made one of these memorial markers for him, and it would be put outside of his hut or his home, the Giriama people of Kenya. And they're carved wooden posts, but the person's not buried there. It's sort of like the spirit has entered this post called the kakango. It's illegal to take them out of Africa today. They were quite collectible because these are semi-nomadic people. When they moved, they took the kakango with them. When they moved a second time, then they believe the spirit has gone on to heaven and they left it behind. See, everything in Africa is about sculpture. They didn't have a written language. They didn't know about the word art. Everything was utilitarian. It was to communicate ideas and thoughts and values and culture, but it was all done through sculpture. It's like if we're going to tell the history of George Washington and we're going to bring out a statue of him, and that's all we have. And then the next president, here's Lincoln, and it's all done through sculpture. That's how it's done. And so they didn't really have a word for it. We consider it art in the West. It's very abstract. Next slide, please. There's a kind of a close-up of them. They're human effigies is what they are. Next slide, please. Almost finished here. This is the American Gallery. This is a status piece. This is a high boy. Now, Lee Kino from Antiques Roadshow. You've probably seen him before. He's come to the museum on a couple occasions, and he went through the American Gallery. He says, this is the best collection of American art and material culture, probably in the Southeast United States. Not the biggest, but it's the best quality. And here is a 1776 highboy, time of George Washington, from Philadelphia. It would have been built by a team of craftsmen with a ball and claw, symbolizing the pearl grasping the dragon grasping the pearl of wisdom, made of mahogany. It's a status piece. You would have put it in your house in 1776 in Philadelphia, where people could see it, and they'd be like, "Oh, whoa, man, that's incredible! It's a status. Show off your status, whatever that is today. Maybe that's a Porsche or a yacht today, but it was made in two sections, and this is the show-off piece. It's not very functional because it's really, really tall. It's hard to. I have to use a step to get up to the top portions of it. It's got a bonnet on the top, finials, and scallop carvings on it as well. And it was made for Captain Thomas Fraser, who married Rebecca Alden in 1716, the grandfather of Pilgrim and John Alden, I believe, who also has connections to the Mayflower. Next slide, please. There's an up-close one of it. And then next slide. It's one of the most striking pieces in the American Gallery. Anthony Corvell. Now remember I told you about the Empire style? Anthony Corvell got this illusion from the fall of the Napoleonic Empire, and he came to Philadelphia and he opened up a furniture store, and he made furniture, and he introduced the Empire style and its popularity all up and down the East Coast of the United States. He really made it popular. He might have not been the first to introduce it, but he made it popular. And he had a huge popular gallery, and he made this piece that was a commissioned piece for a Quaker gentleman. We had a scholar who had the blueprints to this, and he thought that this was a fantasy piece. It's gigantic. And when he found out that we had it, he came down and he couldn't believe. But it's all neoclassical, that Empire style, heavy, blocky. It's got, it's got Greek columns, big, massive elements. The star on it is usually a symbol of the Napoleonic Empire as well. So it is a very fashionable showroom in 1825 in Philadelphia. Quite amazing piece. Now, the owner of this, Kenneth Dow, who the gallery is named after, the Kenneth Dow Gallery of American Art. He had this in St. Augustine, and he had it, when we went to pick it up, he had it upside down. He had the top part, thinking that big base supported the feet, the dolphin feet. Those are actually dolphin feet. So he had it upside down, and he'd been using it for years and years upside down. We said, hey, Kenneth, really happy that you're donating this to the museum. It's going to be a showcase, but you have it upside down. Next slide, please. There's a close-up of it. It's one of my favorite pieces of furniture in the entire museum. I just marvel at it. I'd hate to move it because remember, they charge you taxing on every room. So the wardrobe is a way to get around that. Next slide, please. Limners. We also have some very early paintings, American paintings. This is Joseph Whiting's stock. He was 16 years old. He was a portrait painter. There's only like maybe 24 of his paintings known, and he specialized in children. This is Little Miss Perkins. It was also featured on a very prominent arts magazine on the cover of it, believe it or not. He was what's called an itinerant painter in early America, where they would go from town to town, painting carriages, houses, signs, and of course people, because that's how people were remembered. And they were usually what's called a good likeness. In Europe, they showed you better than you are. They'd show your hair better and they wouldn't show a mole. But in America, they showed just the way you looked. Next slide, please. There's a close-up of probably one of my favorite paintings. There's a lot of theory that they painted the bodies in advance and they plopped the head down. So they weren't very good with proportion because there weren't art schools. So proportion was really hard on these early painters. They really couldn't train very well. I hope you enjoyed the talk today and this kind of quick run around through the museum's galleries, looking at some of the most important objects in the collection, and there's a lot more. Thanks for coming this afternoon and enjoying MOAS treasures. Thank you. And I'll take any questions.
Thanks so much, Zach. That was so informative. Wow.
Thank you.
I can't actually wait to come and get a tour myself. I haven't even had one.
Well, it's quite amazing to think that it is the largest general museum in the Southeast. I guess you have to get to the Smithsonian before you get to one bigger, but I'm not talking about science museums. There's some science museums, you know, like kind of kid science museums that are bigger. Square footage.
Phenomenal. Well, there are a couple questions that came through, and I know we did have, I had a few members that messaged me that they could not log in. So the good news is this presentation we're going to be able to send it back out to all of the members as well. So, because it was so informative and so great. And I'm glad that you all are actually taking tours and that you're safe and everybody wears a mask, because that was one of my questions.
We are doing small tour groups,
okay,
about 15. Everybody does have to wear a mask, and we have stools and everybody can sit down in the gallery and carry the stool with them, and they can sit 6 feet apart.
Okay, wonderful.
And those are adult groups. We really have only been doing adult groups.
Perfect. And that was one of the questions about how many visitors do you get in a year? I guess maybe we'll clarify that. Maybe a normal year and
100,000, close to 100,000.
Really?
Yeah, believe it or not. And that includes school groups, though.
Okay, that's great. Another question that came in: which was the most popular of the traveling exhibits?
You mean in the past or currently?
I don't know.
Well, I'll tell you both.
Okay.
So right now we have a really great history of the guitar exhibit, and it's from the earliest guitar. You know, it started with the lute and the oud, and it goes through Hawaiian guitars all the way up to heavy metal guitars that rock bands would use. It's fantastic. It's from New York. It's on display right now. My favorite exhibit, and I think the most incredible exhibit the museum had, was a science exhibit. And there's been so many. I mean, think about that. I've been there 27 years. Was the Great Asian Dinosaurs. It was the largest traveling show of real dinosaurs from the continent of Asia, and that came in the early 2000s, and that was really amazing. We had an armor exhibit with full body armor of knights and stuff. That was pretty good too. But I'm a little bit partial to that dinosaur exhibit because we had a T-Rex on display, but it was the Asian version of the T-Rex called a Tyrannosaurus bataar.
Wow. Oh my gosh, that's so interesting. All right, let's see. Here's another question. I may have missed this comment, but how many permanent exhibits? Okay, did I just read that one? No. Yeah, how many permanent exhibits do you have?
So if you had an hour to spend in the museum, I calculated this one time, you have about 5 minutes per gallery.
Okay.
So we have Africa, we have the giant ground sloth, we have the kids wing, we have the American Gallery, we have the Route Museum, we have the Bushell Museum, the Chinese Museum, or the Chinese Gallery as well. And then we have the Brown Museum. Then we have the Planetarium as well. So, depending, nine permanent galleries and about 4 or 5 changing galleries. Right now we have a decorative fan exhibit that's really cool from Europe. So, decorative fans, they're usually hand painted, not mass produced. Really beautiful, believe it or not.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much. I learned a lot myself. I've been to a couple of events, dinners at the museum, but I haven't actually taken the tour. So I'm looking forward to it. I know all of our members will be looking forward to it as well. So thanks so much, Zach. We appreciate the fact that you took the time out of your day to help us out. No
problem.
It was a great
What would be really good is that when the all clears sounded someday, that the WISE group comes and takes a tour and does a planetarium show and to the galleries. And I think that would be a nice field trip for the group. And
Absolutely.
It's air conditioned.
Yes, I think that sounds like a great idea.
And I can give you a special price. and I can do the tour. Thank you so
Awesome.
much.
Thanks, Zach. I appreciate it. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for the members that were able to tune in. The ones that will be watching this, the recorded version, I'm so sorry you didn't get to log in today. We're still working out some of these technical difficulties with our virtual programming, but next week we have a little different production going on. Costa is going to definitely put on a great cooking show for us. We have the TV station involved. So definitely no technical glitches next week. Thanks so much for tuning in. We will see you all next week. Have a great day.